Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of History Quest. I'm your host, Brian Haynes, and this month we are at Stahl's Lake Park, one of the most historic parks in McLeod County. You may have read a story I wrote recently in the Hutchinson Leader about Stahl's Lake, and so we thought this month, why not take that story and bring it to life by going on location. Of all of McLeod County's parks, one of the most historic is Stahl's Lake Park, just north of Hutchinson, nestled between Stahl Lake and French Lake. Upon entering the park, it's apparent that history certainly exists there. Surrounded by trees, the park gives off a feeling of being back in McLeod County's famed and long extinct Big Woods. An old red building stands out in the forefront, and off to the east is a short and lone silo, a ghost of a farm site that once stood proud. The park was named after Charles Stahl, a settler who made the first claim in the area just north of County Road 73 across from the park. Stahl was one of the first settlers to come to McLeod County. He and his wife built a farm and lived on the land for many years. Interestingly, lakes often bore the name of the folks who settled near them, and thus the lake north of County Road 73 came to be known as Stahl's Lake. Opposite the lake is French Lake, which of course is named after a man called French. Stahl may have been the first settler to make a claim near the lake, but he certainly was not the first person to make use of the land. Taoya Teduda, better known as Little Crow, frequented the area near the lake and made use of it by setting up a temporary camp there. In fact, Herman Popp, another early settler on the lake, knew Little Crow well and is said to have smoked with him on several occasions. The park and the lakes that border it would have looked much different in those days. There was no vast farm fields and almost no people in the area. There was certainly no County Road 73. The only known trail to the lake was a simple cartway that went from the Stahl cabin to Hutchinson. In summer of 1862, when Dakota war parties began raiding homes and killing settlers, the few residents in the area fled. One of them, Charles Stahl, enlisted in the Hutchinson Home Guard and fought in the Battle of Hutchinson. He and his family lived in the stockade for the duration of the war. Settlers came and went through the late 1800s. Those who stayed built homes, barns, and roads near the park. In the 1890s, Herman Kruger owned the land where the northwest corner of the park is in 2022. Another family, the Fritzie family, lived where the park is located now. For a time, Mrs. Fritzie allowed neighbors to garden on the land, and it's said that gardeners occasionally found stone arrowheads and other ancient Native American tools in the area. This suggests that the site was once populated with people from the Middle Woodland period that lasted from 100 BC to 500 AD. There's no doubt that Stahl's Park is loaded with history. From Little Crow to Charles Stahl, the area has surely seen its fair share of famous historic figures. It begs the question, however, what other places in McLeod County are filled with hidden history, and what kind of treasures can be unearthed there? I guess for that, I'll have to go on yet another history quest. All right, so at Stahl's Lake Park, behind me we actually have French Lake. And the reason it's called French Lake is because a gentleman, and this goes back into the 1850s, 1860s, who lived on the site here, his last name was French. Back in those days, a lake was typically named really after the people who lived by it. So you have French Lake here, and across the street you have Stahl's Lake, named after Charles Stahl, who lived across the lake. If you look behind me, we have Stahl's Lake. And like I said in the story, Stahl's Lake is actually on the north side of the park. Charles Stahl, the original settler out here, would have actually been just down the road, County Road 73 here, and right to the north of the road is where his cabin would have sat. Of course, it was long ago taken down, but very historic site. At one time at Stahl's Lake Park, running south from the park to Hutchinson was a cartway. And the location of the cartway has been lost. It probably would have looked something similar to this, although, you know, of course the grass wouldn't be neatly mowed and you'd have wagon ruts running through it. But that was the only mode of transportation coming out to this area. So any settler in this area would have had to take that cartway going back to Hutchinson. So these cartways and other trails that the settlers used, in many cases were actually here before the settlers even got here. You of course wouldn't call them cartways, they would have been more like footpaths, but these footpaths were actually laid down by the Native Americans that would frequent the area. And as a matter of fact, most of the state and countries, like major roadways, were originally trade routes or travel routes by the Native Americans that lived in that area. So the cartway going through Stahl's Park, or I should say the cartway that at one time went through Stahl's Park, was probably a path originally laid down by Dakota or maybe even Ojibwa hunters that were coming through the region. So when the settlers came in, they just used those exact same trails. So Stahl's Park is just one of the many places in Minnesota where people at one time could find arrowheads. A lot of those sites, it's a little tougher to find them now once they've been built on. Chances of finding one around here are probably pretty slim these days. But at any rate, there was a time where people could find stone artifacts on the site. And the thing about stone artifacts is it indicates habitation that goes back thousands of years. By the time white settlers were settling in Minnesota, Native Americans, for the most part were using firearms, but those that were still using, any kind of a bow or spear or anything like that, were likely using some kind of a metal that they could melt down or just sharpen and put into their arrows. So if you find a stone arrowhead, that means that it is from time before there was any kind of trade with Europe. So those stone arrowheads can be thousands of years old, but just kind of a neat little tidbit about Stahl's Lake and what you might find when you're out here. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the studio. So that was our story about Stahl's Park, just north of Hutchinson. Great place, a lot of history. I gotta say I really enjoyed being there. Moving on from Stahl's Park now, we're just finishing up a county fair here in McLeod County. And of course, we had a few things down at the fair. We had some big quilts that were put into the fair's display since it was their 150th anniversary. And I was there picking the quilts up, and it's always such a almost sad experience to be there the day after the fair. It was just so vibrant the day before, and then it's so quiet on the day of the fair. But at any rate, it prompted me to write an article about a little bit of fair history. After a little research, what I found out was that though this was the 150th anniversary of this fair, it was not at all the first fair in McLeod County. Actually, there was one way, way long ago, back in the 1800s, so mid-1800s. So I'm going to tell you a little story about that right now. The 2022 fair was significant in being the 150th anniversary of the event. Looking back on some early history of the fair, it's safe to say that the ordeal has come a long way since the days of exhibitors gathered under the shade of a single tent. It was from those humble beginnings that the fair evolved into one of the best, at least in my opinion, one of the best mid-sized county fairs in the state of Minnesota. After digging a little deeper, as a historian is apt to do, I found that the 2022 fair may have been the 150th celebration of the McLeod County Agricultural Association, yet it wasn't the first fair ever to be held in McLeod County. The year was 1859. McLeod County and the settlements within it were in an infant state. The region was, for all functions, a relative wilderness. Remote as it may have been, however, it was home to several families that eked out their livelihoods on the frontier. Most were farmers, and just like their modern counterparts, took pride in the crops they grew and the livestock they tended. As a result, the McLeod County Agricultural Society was formed. The organization adopted its constitution on March of 1859. The preamble read, "To encourage the improvement of agriculture, horticulture, and the mechanic and household arts." Its officers were John Stevens as president, Lewis Harrington as vice president, Clayton Chandler as treasurer, and Alonzo Jennings as secretary. Meeting notices appeared monthly in the Glencoe Register, the settlement's main news source of the time. On July 30th of 1859, a notice appeared in the register of a county-wide fair to be held from October 19 to 20 of that same year. It would be the county's first fair, and prizes would be awarded for the best field crop, fruits, vegetables, grain, bread, cattle, horses, sheep, poultry, swine, household manufacturers such as furniture, dairy produce, floral arrangements, mechanic works such as boots or harnesses, etc. And it would also feature a plowing match and a horse show. That first fair went off without a hitch and was featured on the front page of the Register on October 22nd. It reads as follows: "Notwithstanding the lateness of the season and the state of the weather on Thursday last, a large number of citizens from Glencoe and McLeod County turned out to the first agricultural fair ever held in this county, which, under the circumstances, reflected great credit upon our citizens. The articles exhibited were not numerous, but well selected, and for the first attempt in such a new country as McLeod, they would compare favorably with those put on exhibition east of the Big Woods." That very first county fair in 1859 was a far cry from what we have today. Yet it set in motion an expectation of a county-wide agricultural organization like the one you see today. And although their fair may not have been the big attraction as the current one, it's a piece of history that's an important part of the county and one that I just had to write about, even if it is a day late and $1 short. So that was our story about the fair. I think a lot of people are under the impression that the first fair was in 1872, but really that was just the first fair of the current organization that handles the county fair. And in fact, there was another one quite a few years before that. Moving on from the fair, however, I also wanted to do a little story about one of the prized attractions down at the museum. If you've never been there, or if it's been a long time since you've been there, we have a canoe at the museum. And this canoe is very old. In fact, it's the oldest canoe ever found in the state of Minnesota. And it's a dugout canoe, dug out from a log that was found in Big Swan Lake, which isn't even in McLeod County, it's in Meeker County. However, the canoe ended up in McLeod County. And at any rate, this month I wanted to share a little backstory about the canoe in hopes that maybe you'll come down and take a visit. So here we go. The McLeod County History Museum is filled with artifacts. For that, there is no doubt. First-time museum goers often comment on just how well the displays look, how informative they are, and how many artifacts are housed in the museum. Few would be hard-pressed to argue. The museum is home to hundreds of thousands of artifacts that range from everyday household items to unique and invaluable items such as a small hatchet found at the Little Bighorn battle site or the Peruvian mummy that rests quietly in the corner. Of all the artifacts in the museum, perhaps the one that makes the biggest impression is the canoe. This is, of course, no ordinary canoe, but a dugout canoe that is currently the oldest of its kind ever to be found in the entire state of Minnesota. In a strange twist of irony, however, the canoe was not even found in McLeod County. The year was 1957. It was late November, that period of autumn where winter lurks right around the corner, ready to launch itself at any moment. Meeker County's Big Swan Lake was already beginning to ice over, and the 15 state workers who gathered there were forced to cut through 4 inches of ice to seine for carp, a task most often referred to as drag netting. They commenced chopping ice at 7 a.m. on the south section of the lake. Holes were cut in the ice at 100-foot intervals, and a 3,500-foot net was dragged along the bottom with hopes of catching and removing as many carp as they could. The net was pulled from the water just before lunchtime. The crew snagged 175,000 pounds of fish and what at first appeared to be a log that tore a 15-foot hole in the net. Upon closer inspection, however, the crew found that they had no simple log, but a long-lost artifact from a long-past era in Minnesota history. It was a canoe, a dugout canoe, that was no doubt made by Native Americans. Some of the crew immediately went to work cutting off small pieces of the canoe for personal souvenirs. It was then left on the ice for 2 days until 12 workers hoisted it into a truck and drove it to the McLeod County Fairgrounds for safekeeping. There was little thought as to who would own the canoe. In fact, a 1954 ruling automatically gave ownership of the artifact to the state of Minnesota. There was little doubt in anyone's mind that the canoe was old. Likely older than any artifact from the 18th or 19th century. Just how old it was, however, nobody could say for sure. The consensus was that the item needed to be stored in a museum where it could be preserved as well as displayed. In January of 1958, the canoe was transferred to the McLeod County Historical Society, where it has been housed ever since. Finding a canoe buried in the mud was rare, but not outlandish by any means. Up until the advent of watercrafts made of synthetic materials, it was common practice for canoes and other wooden, bark, or hide flotations to be stored under the ice through the winter. Being submerged in water, the canoe would not dry out, weather, or warp as badly as it would have if it was left above ground in the elements. The likely scenario was that the owner of the canoe submerged it in the fall and simply never returned for it. Dugout canoes were common in North America and were widely used by Native Americans well into the 19th century. In fact, according to Dakota author and physician Seth Eastman, a dugout canoe was favorable, especially in areas where birch bark was not readily available. Suitable trees were softwoods that could easily be hollowed out. Cottonwoods were the most common. In the prehistoric era, the inside of the trunk was burned out to remove the wood. Later, with the introduction of metal tools, the trunks were smoothed out to create a nice hull that could be shaped and curved. The shape of the big swan canoe, as well as the makeup of it, hinted that it was far older than anything made by a Dakota or Ojibwa American. The canoe was hollowed out with fire, and the outer hull was rough with knots that were not removed. Either it was built in haste, or the builder did not have the tools to smooth it out. In 2013, the Maritime Heritage of Minnesota did a study on the canoe and determined it to have been crafted somewhere between 1030 AD to 1220 AD. That marks it as the oldest canoe to ever be found in the state of Minnesota. And that is an artifact that is definitely worth seeing. So that's our story of the canoe. And like I said in the article, the canoe is very much worth coming and seeing. You think of all the museums in Minnesota, even the state museum, and to know that right here in McLeod County in Hutchinson, we have the oldest that's ever been found in the state. And it's just, looking at it just brings so many possible scenarios to mind of how it came to be where it was, why it was abandoned, and everything else. And just as much as how it looks where it's set up, it's displayed wonderfully. It's behind glass, so it can't be damaged or anything like that. It can't be touched. There's a big mural behind it. We have taxidermied birds surrounding it. It's definitely worth a look. So come on down and take a look at it. That's all I can say. Now, last but not least, I have a story about the history of drugstores, not just here in McLeod County, but in America. I think anybody who grew up or was born, say, before the early to mid 1990s or 2000s, you remember the small town drugstores. A lot of them were more than a drugstore. A lot of them almost doubled as like a cafe. They'd have a soda fountain behind them. You could get ice cream. You could get candy. They would have toys. And it's you don't see that as much anymore. The drugstore has kind of evolved into the pharmacy. And though there may be some gifts and stuff in there, it just doesn't have that same feeling as the small town drugstore once had in the little rural towns across Minnesota and the rest of America. With that being said, I had to write a story about it because that's what I do. And here it is, so sit back and enjoy. There's a place in every town that drips with history. It's a place of fond memories, a place where old men gathered for morning coffee, where kids ran to the counter for a soda, and where a shopper could find an array of items such as a greeting card or even a gift shop style trinket. The place's main purpose was medicine, from simple treatments for minor aches and pains to prescribed pharmaceuticals. It was the great American drugstore, and it was a place made of memories. The history of the drugstore in America reaches far back in time. It was born in the Middle Ages, evolved in the colonial era, and began to modernize in the late 1800s. By the turn of the century, it entered a gilded era where nearly every community was home to a popular pharmacy run by a local man in a crisp white shirt. Sadly, the age of the local drugstore is all but over, yet one can't deny its fascinating history. The origins of the drugstore go back to a time where medicine was based less on science and more on superstition and home remedies. As far back as ancient Babylon, people looked to an apothecary to formulate and dispense medicines to physicians, surgeons, and patients. The apothecary created his concoctions from plants, herbs, roots, or anything else that was believed to have medicinal properties. The medicines were sold in an apothecary shop. This practice carried on through the Middle Ages and Renaissance and was even prevalent in the colonial era. The topic of America's first pharmacy counter is one that's up for debate. According to history, the first drugstore was in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Martha Washington was said to have collected her prescriptions. However, since the store was not operated by a licensed pharmacist, many believe the title of the first drugstore belongs to New Orleans, where a pharmacist opened shop in 1823. No matter which was first, the drugstores of the 18th and early 19th centuries were more akin to the classic apothecary shop than the modern pharmacy. The beginning of the classic American drugstore begins around the time of the Civil War. The conflict between the United States and Confederacy was a bloody one. Modern weaponry and ancient battle tactics combined to create wholesale slaughter on the battlefield. Amputations were common. As a result, amateur pharmacists began cropping up alongside roadsides near battlefields where wounded and weary soldiers were marching. Many of these druggists were more akin to snake oil salesmen, who concocted cures made primarily of alcohol and even small amounts of poison to give a brief sense of relief to a painful wound. Like an old Western, many of these salesmen operated their drugstore from the back of a wagon. As prevalent as the snake oil salesman was, however, there were real pharmacists who set up tents along the roadside and sold medicines that could ease discomfort. Medicine and health practice began to change after the Civil War. As science advanced, so did drug treatment, and pharmacists began to abandon alchemy in favor of modern medicine. Around this same time, early forms of the classic drugstore began appearing in small communities across the nation, and by the late 1800s, nearly every community was home to a pharmacist and a well-stocked drugstore. In Hutchinson, Oliver Dennett opened up the OD drugstore. Lester Prairie had the Schmidt drugstore, and Winstead was home to the MP Mahone drugstore. The stores that opened in the late 1800s and early 20th century entered a golden era of the American drugstore. These businesses began expanding from selling medicine alone and began offering postcards, gift items, and toys. Many of them had counters where one could buy candy, coffee, or a drink from an old-fashioned soda fountain. The drugstores changed little through the early portion of the 20th century and enjoyed success as a classic piece of Americana. In some ways, the stores resembled a general store more than their intended purpose. Many alive today remember the Rexall drugstores in Hutchinson and Lester Prairie, or the Whedon drugstore in Glencoe. Though pharmacists still exist, many of which still offer retail items aside from medicines, their time in the sun as a popular fixture in a small community has begun to set. It's more common now to see a drugstore that is part of a large corporate chain rather than the little shop owned by a local pharmacist. Be that as it may, the classic American drugstore will never fully leave us and still exists with many other things in our rich history. So that was our story of the drugstore. Like I said, I think almost everybody kind of has a memory of a local drugstore. I mean, I myself have one We had a tiny little drugstore in Paynesville that's now gone, and actually my great uncle owned it, and it's very fond in that town as well. So like I said, I think everybody, no matter where you're from, can kind of relate to that story. So moving on from the stories, I've got a little bit of museum news to share with you. First and foremost, I want to talk about our annual meeting. Every year we hold an annual meeting. We have our board members who are up for re-election, and so the voting body, which are our members, can come and approve the selection of board members. And they can also approve our budget, approve our minutes that we had from last year. And it's a good way to come to a business meeting and just find out what's been going on at the museum, aside from just your little tidbits of museum news that pop out here and there. As always, we have a guest speaker. Normally we try to get somebody that is like an author or somebody like that to come in. This year we decided to change things up a little bit, and we're having a local historian come in. You maybe all know Bill Arndt here from Hutchinson. I've known Bill for a few years now, and I got to tell you, I don't know if there's many storytellers around here who are as good as Bill Arndt. And Bill has a background with rural schools. If you come up to the museum, you'll see the cupola right when you drive up. That was from the school that Bill went to. And so with that said, he's going to come in, he's going to talk to us about rural schools, and I'm actually really looking forward to this one. The event will be on October 20th. It starts at 6:30 p.m. We'll have coffee, snacks, lemonade, water, probably cider since it's fall for anybody who comes. Admission is free, and we hope to see you there. Also, we are starting to gear up for our big Christmas event in December. Now, I know it's just September, so this is a way off yet, but it takes a lot to do these big events. We had our Whoopie Fest last spring, and we had a big Christmas event last year at Christmas time. And that's kind of the route we're going now. Instead of having many small little events throughout the years, we're doing 2 really big events instead. We've had some great success with that. We raise a lot of funds, and we get a huge crowd in for these events. Last year at Christmas, we had a kind of a Victorian style Santa Claus. We had the Mid-Minnesota Concert Band. We had Christmas cookies. The whole museum was done up. We had carolers. It was a great time. We had over 200 people come to the museum, which has been unheard of in the past. We're going to do something similar this year. It's going to be street scenes. So we're going to display street scenes from each town through the Christmases past. So we'll get to see what, Glencoe, Hutchinson, Lester Prairie, Winstead, what they looked like years ago with all their lights going down the streets, down their main streets. We're also going to have a Santa come this year. You might know him. He's a local Hutchinson guy, so we're not having a Victorian Santa Claus, but we're having the real Santa Claus come this year. So, make sure and come and check that out. Tell them what you want for Christmas. This will be on the first Thursday in December. We're still working out some of the details. We're hoping to get the Mid-Minnesota Concert Band back again, and it should be a great event, so hope to see you there. Lastly, I just want to thank Sentence to Serve here in McLeod County. They came and they cleaned off our building. If you've been up to the museum, you'll know that specifically the north side of the building that doesn't typically see a lot of sunlight was getting a little dingy, so they come out with a bleach solution and they sprayed it down and cleaned it up, and it's looking great. So big thanks to Sentence to Serve. That is all we have for you now this month. So I hope you enjoyed the stories. I hope to see you at some of our upcoming events, and until then, we'll see you next month. Thank you.